Some thoughts don't feel like thoughts. They feel like something you're experiencing in real time. Not distant, not abstract, but immediate. They carry weight, detail, and a sense of presence that makes them hard to ignore. And because of that, they don't feel optional. They feel like something you have to engage with. You might notice this when a thought appears and instantly pulls your attention. It doesn't ask for it, it takes it. It feels important before you even have time to question it. And within seconds, you're inside it, following it, reacting to it as if it's something happening right now. What makes this confusing is that nothing external has changed. The situation isn't happening anymore, or hasn't even happened at all, but your mind responds as if it is. It recreates the moment, the feeling, the tension, and presents it to you in a way that feels real. And once it feels real, it becomes difficult to step away from. Because your brain isn't treating it like a thought. It's treating it like something that matters in the present. Your brain doesn't experience thoughts the way you think it does. It doesn't clearly separate what's happening from what's imagined. When a thought is vivid enough, detailed enough, or emotionally charged enough, your brain processes it in a very similar way to something real. It activates the same patterns, the same responses, the same internal reactions. And because of that, the thought doesn't feel like something distant. It feels immediate. It feels relevant. This is why certain thoughts feel stronger than others, not because they're more accurate, but because they're more vivid. They carry more detail, more emotion, more intensity, and your brain uses that intensity as a signal. It assumes that if something feels this real, it must matter, so it prioritizes it. It brings it forward, keeps it active, and makes it harder to ignore. And the more it does that, the more real the thought begins to feel. There's also a feedback loop that strengthens this effect. The more attention you give a thought, the more detailed it becomes, and the more detailed it becomes, the more real it feels. And once it feels real, you give it even more attention. You start to build on it. You add context, expand it, imagine different outcomes, explore different possibilities, and each layer adds more depth, more clarity, more presence, until the thought feels like something you're inside of, rather than something you're observing. At that point, it's no longer just a thought. It's an experience your brain is actively maintaining. And because you're engaged with it, it continues. This is why it can feel like you're stuck inside your own thinking, because your brain isn't just producing thoughts, it's sustaining them in a way that makes them feel real. The emotional layer plays a significant role in this as well. When a thought carries emotion, it becomes amplified. It feels stronger, more urgent, more meaningful, and your brain uses that emotional intensity as a signal that the thought is important. So it holds on to it. It replays it, expands it, keeps it active. Because from your brain's perspective, something that creates a strong emotional response must matter. But emotion doesn't always reflect reality. It reflects how something feels in the moment. And when that feeling is recreated through thought, it can make something imagined feel just as real as something that actually happened. This is why certain thoughts are harder to let go of. Not because they're true, but because they feel true. And that feeling is what keeps them active. The reason these thoughts feel so convincing is because your brain doesn't evaluate them before reacting to them. The reaction happens first. The moment the thought appears, especially if it carries detail or emotion, your brain responds as if it's already relevant. It doesn't pause to question whether it's accurate or useful. It treats it as something that matters right now. And once that reaction happens, it becomes difficult to separate yourself from the thought, because now you're not just observing it, you're inside it. You're responding to it, adjusting to it, following where it leads. And that makes it feel even more real, because you're actively participating in it. This is where the loop strengthens. The thought creates a reaction. The reaction gives it weight, and that weight makes it feel like something that deserves attention. So you continue engaging with it, building on it, reinforcing it, and the more that cycle repeats, the faster it happens, until eventually the thought doesn't need to convince you. It already feels real the moment it appears. There's also a pattern in how your brain prioritizes certain thoughts over others. It doesn't choose based on truth or accuracy. It chooses based on intensity, familiarity, and repetition. The thoughts you've engaged with the most become the easiest to access. They become your default. So when your mind is free, when there's nothing else demanding your attention, it returns to what it already knows. Thoughts that feel familiar, thoughts you've followed before, thoughts that have been reinforced through repetition. And because those thoughts have been repeated, they feel stronger. Not because they contain more truth, but because they've been practiced more. Your brain has built a pathway to them, and it follows that pathway automatically. This is why certain thoughts feel like they're always there, waiting. Not because they're important, but because they've been repeated enough times to become familiar. And familiarity creates the illusion of truth. What makes this even more convincing is how quickly your mind fills in gaps. A single thought rarely stays as it is, it expands. Your brain adds detail, context, and interpretation almost instantly, and those additions make the thought feel more complete, more structured, more real. You don't just think something briefly, you begin to see it, imagine it, play it out. You create a version of it that feels coherent, and that coherence gives it a sense of validity. It feels like something that has shape, something that exists clearly enough to respond to. But that clarity isn't coming from reality. It's being constructed in real time. Your brain is building the experience as you engage with it, and because it happens so quickly, it feels like the thought was already complete when it appeared. This is why it's difficult to question it, because by the time you notice it, it already feels fully formed. Over time, this process becomes automatic. You don't notice how the thought builds, how the details are added, how the feeling develops. You only experience the result. A thought that feels real, immediate, and difficult to ignore, and because you only experience the final version, it feels like it arrived that way, like it was always that complete, that convincing, but it wasn't. It was built step by step through your attention. Each time you engage with a thought, you add to it, you strengthen it, you make it easier for your brain to recreate that same level of detail the next time it appears. And eventually it doesn't need as much input. It reaches that level of intensity almost instantly. That's when it feels like your thoughts are controlling you. Not because they are, but because they've been reinforced enough to feel automatic. Another reason thoughts feel real is because your brain is constantly trying to turn uncertainty into something concrete. It doesn't like vague impressions. It prefers things that feel defined, shaped, and understandable. So when a thought appears, especially one connected to fear, memory, or self-doubt, your brain starts organizing it immediately. It gives it structure. It turns it into something clearer than it actually is. This happens so fast that you rarely notice it. A single concern becomes a scenario. A single memory becomes a full replay. A single possibility becomes something that feels almost inevitable. And once that structure is in place, the thought no longer feels vague. It feels specific. It feels like something you can see, almost something you can step into. That structure is what gives the thought so much power, because your brain responds more strongly to what feels concrete than to what feels uncertain. The more shaped the thought becomes, the more real it seems, and the more real it seems, the harder it becomes to step back and see it as just a thought. So what keeps the thought alive is not only the content itself, but the fact that your brain keeps giving it shape, definition, and presence until it feels like something more than imagination. Your attention plays a major role in this. Whatever your attention rests on for long enough starts to feel larger, heavier, and more significant. This is true with thoughts just as much as it is with anything else. The longer your mind stays with a thought, the more detail it notices, the more interpretations it creates, and the more emotionally charged it can become. At first, a thought may appear quickly and seem small, but if your attention locks onto it, even for a short time, it begins to grow. You start asking what it means, you compare it to other memories, you imagine where it could lead, and all of that gives it more weight. This is why some thoughts feel impossible to ignore. It's not always because they're powerful at the start, it's because your attention has amplified them. Your brain has spent enough time on them that they now feel central, important, and urgent. And once that happens, the thought becomes more than an idea. It becomes something that feels psychologically present, something your brain keeps returning to because it has already learned that this is where attention tends to go. Memory strengthens this process even further. Your brain does not store experiences as fixed recordings. It stores pieces. images, sensations, emotional tones, fragments of language, and then rebuilds them whenever they return. That means every time you revisit a thought or memory, you are not simply recalling it, you are reconstructing it. And reconstruction gives your brain room to intensify it. A remembered moment can feel sharper than it originally did. A past interaction can seem more loaded, more emotionally meaningful, more complete than it was in real time. That doesn't happen because the memory is becoming more accurate. It happens because your brain is rebuilding it through your current attention, your current fears, your current interpretations. This makes thoughts feel real in a very particular way. They don't just repeat, they become refreshed. They come back with renewed detail and renewed emotional force. And because of that, your brain doesn't experience them as old or distant. It experiences them as active and current. That is why certain thoughts don't feel like memories at all. They feel like something your mind is reliving, not just remembering. At a certain point, the thought no longer needs to prove itself. It already feels believable. Your brain has repeated it, shaped it, amplified it, and emotionally reinforced it enough times that it now arrives with force. It shows up already charged, already convincing, already familiar. And because it is familiar, your mind lowers its guard around it. This is one of the most important parts of the pattern. Familiar thoughts often feel true simply because they have been repeated so often. Not because they are accurate, but because they are known. Your brain trusts what it recognizes. It reacts less like it is evaluating the thought and more like it is accepting it. That's why these thoughts can become so sticky. They don't just appear. They arrive with a history of repetition behind them. They carry the weight of every previous time they were believed, followed, or emotionally felt, and that accumulated weight gives them presence. So when a thought feels very real, it is often because your brain has rehearsed it enough times that it now responds to it as if it belongs in the foreground of your experience. One of the reasons these thoughts feel so difficult to question is because your brain is not designed to pause before reacting. It reacts first, then evaluates later. And when a thought arrives with enough intensity, your brain moves straight into response mode. It treats the thought as something relevant, something that requires attention, before it has even considered whether it is accurate. That immediate response creates momentum. The moment you react, you begin to engage. You follow the thought, expand it, connect it to other ideas, and that engagement reinforces the original reaction. It makes it feel justified, as if your response proves the thought was worth reacting to in the first place. This is where the loop strengthens. The thought creates a reaction. The reaction confirms the thought, and that confirmation makes it feel even more real. And because this happens quickly, it feels automatic. It doesn't feel like a process you're participating in. It feels like something that's simply happening to you. But what's actually happening is a pattern of reaction that has been reinforced enough times to feel immediate and unquestionable. There is also a subtle expectation built into this pattern. Your brain begins to anticipate certain thoughts before they even fully appear. It recognizes familiar patterns, familiar emotional tones, and it prepares for them in advance. And that anticipation makes the thought feel even more real when it arrives. It's similar to how your mind can prepare for something you expect to happen. The moment it begins, it feels more intense, more noticeable, because your brain was already tuned toward it. The same thing happens with repeated thoughts. Your brain becomes sensitized to them. So when the thought appears, it doesn't feel new. It feels like something you were already expecting, and that expectation increases its impact. It feels stronger, more immediate, more difficult to ignore. Over time, this creates a feedback loop where your brain not only responds to thoughts but begins to anticipate them. And that anticipation makes them feel even more real, even more present, even more difficult to step away from. What begins to change this pattern is not forcing your thoughts to stop or trying to argue with them. That usually keeps you inside the loop, because even resistance is a form of engagement. You are still interacting with the thought, still giving it attention, still allowing it to remain active. The shift happens when you start to see the thought as something your brain is producing, not something you have to follow. That distinction is small, but it changes how you respond. because once you recognize that the thought is being generated, you can begin to observe it instead of entering it. An observation interrupts the loop. It removes the automatic reaction, even if only slightly at first. It creates a small gap between the thought appearing and you engaging with it. That gap is where the pattern begins to weaken, not because the thought disappears, but because it is no longer being reinforced in the same way it was before. As that gap becomes more familiar, your experience of your thoughts begins to change. They still appear, but they don't carry the same level of control. They don't automatically pull you in. They don't expand in the same way. And that changes how real they feel. Because the sense of reality was never just in the thought itself. It was in how much you engaged with it, how much attention you gave it, how much detail you built into it, how much emotional weight you attached to it. When that engagement begins to reduce, even slightly, the thought loses some of its intensity. It becomes something that passes through your mind instead of something that holds your attention, and over time, that shift builds, not into silence, not into the absence of thought, but into a different relationship with thinking. One where thoughts can still appear, but no longer feel like something you have to believe or follow every time they arise. Another factor that makes thoughts feel real is how quickly your brain blends them with your current state. A thought doesn't stay separate from you. It merges with how you're feeling, how your body is responding, and what your attention is focused on in that moment. And that merging makes it feel immediate, as if it belongs to the present rather than being something created internally. If a thought carries tension, your body can reflect that tension almost instantly. Your breathing changes slightly. Your focus narrows, your awareness shifts toward the thought. And that physical response feeds back into your perception of it. It makes the thought feel grounded, like something connected to your current experience. This creates a loop between thought and feeling. The thought influences your state, and your state reinforces the thought. And because that loop happens so quickly, it feels like a single event rather than a process. That's why certain thoughts don't feel distant or optional. They feel embedded in your experience, as if they are part of what is happening right now, even though they originated entirely within your mind. There is also a tendency for your brain to treat internally generated images as something close to perception. When you imagine something clearly enough, your brain activates similar pathways to when you are actually seeing it. It doesn't draw a strong boundary between imagination and perception if the detail is vivid. So when a thought turns into an image, a scenario, or a sequence, it can feel almost visual. You can see it, hear it, replay it. And that sensory quality adds another layer of realism. It's no longer just an idea. It feels like something you are witnessing. And once it reaches that level, it becomes much harder to dismiss, because it doesn't feel abstract anymore. It feels present, like something unfolding in front of you, and your brain responds to it accordingly. This is why certain thoughts are so difficult to ignore, not because they are more important, but because they are more vivid. They resemble real experience closely enough that your brain treats them as if they belong in the same category. Over time, your brain begins to trust these thoughts not because they are accurate, but because they are consistent. They appear in similar forms, carry similar tones, and follow similar patterns, and that consistency makes them feel reliable. Your brain tends to rely on what is predictable. If something appears repeatedly in a familiar way, it begins to treat it as something stable, something worth paying attention to. And that stability gives the thought a sense of credibility, even if it has no basis outside of repetition. This is how thoughts can begin to feel like facts. Not because they are verified, but because they are repeated. The more often they appear, the less your brain questions them. It starts to accept them as part of your normal thinking process. And once that happens, the thought doesn't need to prove itself anymore. It feels true simply because it is familiar, and that familiarity is enough to keep it active. What ultimately changes how real your thoughts feel is not eliminating them, but reducing the automatic belief attached to them. That belief forms when a thought appears and is immediately accepted, followed, and reinforced. But when that sequence changes, the effect begins to shift. When a thought appears and you don't automatically treat it as something that needs your attention, it loses some of its impact. It doesn't build in the same way. It doesn't gain the same level of detail, emotion, or presence. It remains what it originally was, a passing mental event. And as that becomes more consistent, your brain begins to adjust. It stops assigning the same level of importance to every thought. It stops amplifying them in the same way. And gradually, they begin to feel lighter, less immediate, less real, not because they are gone, but because the pattern that made them feel real is no longer being reinforced in the same way. And that change is what allows your experience of thinking to become more stable, more neutral, and less consuming over time.